Crystal City, Texas, located just 40 miles from the border of Mexico, has had its share of racial tension. In fact, many analysts state that Anglos created the town to take advantage of cheap Mexican labor.
Crystal City was a small town with less than 10,000 people, the majority being Mexican Americans. However, those who were in charge and making the decisions for the city were Anglo. The Anglos were making decisions for the good of their community, but not for the good of the Mexican Americans. The Mexican Americans had no say in anything that happened in their community, leaving them with no rights.
When the migrant workers first moved to Crystal City because of the spinach industry, there were no schools for the children. After a while, a few all-Mexican American elementary schools were set up throughout Crystal City, but were not treated equally to the Anglo schools. On average, the Anglo schools received over twice as much funding for equipment and facilities as the Mexican American schools.
If the Mexican Americans made it past elementary school, they then joined the Anglo secondary schools, but still were not given equal opportunities. The Mexican Americans were not given their rights to an equal education.
In 1961, an Anglo named Andrew Dickens opened a donut shop on a location that local authorities wanted for a right-of-way. The city and county government refused to help him, and he later found out that the same Anglo families had been running the government for a long time.
Dickens started his plan of beating the machine running the local government by talking to Juan Cornejo at the Del Monte Canning Company.
Dickens and Cornejo talked to Ray Schaefer, president of Teamsters Local 657 of San Antonio.
The Teamsters Union provided outside organization and bookkeeping, which allowed more Mexican Americans to pay their $1.75 poll tax.
They also passed out flyers during the poll tax drive to convince more Mexican Americans to vote. The poll tax drive was a success, and by the end of January, 1,139 Mexican Americans had paid their poll tax, while only 542 Anglos had.
Now that Dickens, Cornejo, Schaefer, and the Teamsters Union had convinced more Mexican Americans to vote, they needed to find candidates to run for the city council. They had a hard time finding candidates to run because the Mexican Americans feared retaliation of the Anglos.
Eventually they found 5 Mexican Americans willing to run: Juan Cornejo, Manuel Maldonado, Antonio Cardenas, Ronaldo Mendoza, and Mario Hernandez were the 5 people they convinced to run and were named Los Cinco. They also found 2 candidates willing to run for 2 expiring spots on the school board. When the results came out, the 2 candidates running for school board had lost, but Los Cinco had secured all 5 seats for city council. The Anglos were not happy about this, so they pressured employers to fire Los Cinco or cut their wages at their jobs. Over the next couple of years, little advancement was made towards Mexican American rights in Crystal City, although one exception would be 2 Mexican Americans were elected to the school board. Having that voice on the school board was important because Mexican Americans made up 87% of high school students in 1968, but 2 people still had no say against 5 Anglos.
Mexican Americans were still not given their rights to an equal education and equal rights in school. Mexican American students were limited in many extracurricular activities. They could not speak Spanish on campus. They were only allowed to have 1 Chicana on the cheerleading team. They were not allowed to run for homecoming king or queen. They weren't allowed to run for student council positions. There were no classes about Mexican history, culture, and literature. Mexican contributions were not included in textbooks, and they were not given academic classes, but instead were given vocational courses.
The racial tension came to a boiling point when 2 cheerleading positions became vacant on the team, and the Mexican Americans were told they could not fill it because their total of 1 position had been filled. They first went to school administrators who would not help. They then went to the superintendent, who decided to make a more equal squad of 3 Mexican Americans and 3 Anglos.
The Anglo parents protested, so the school board nullified the superintendent's changes and added that any student that went against or questioned the rules would be expelled.
Basically, what happened at our school was that even though the student population, the Hispanic student population, was about 80%, there was an unwritten rule that as far as the cheerleading squad, which was made up of 4, only 1 could be Hispanic. And that's just the way it always was.
Student leaders Severita Lara, Diana Serna, and Mario Trevino took their concerns to the school board.
Learn that there are things that you can do to break the school rules, but yet those school rules were not right and were not proper, or they were violating our rights as students.
The school board dismissed their concerns by not even allowing the students to speak. Jose Angel Gutierrez, an activist, understood that school boycotts deprive schools of public funding based on average daily student attendance.
I was born and raised in Crystal City, so I knew what the kids were talking about. It was only a 6-year difference between when I graduated from high school and the time I came back to organize this Walkout. the things were the same. We were made to sit in the back. We couldn't speak Spanish. We were called names, corporal punishment. If you spoke Spanish, they'd whip your butt or give you 3 days suspension, and all kinds of things. It was an era of segregation and total prejudice against Mexicans all over South Texas.
Spurring parents and students into action, Gutierrez helped stage a boycott on December 9, 1969.
Each day, more and more students joined until over 2,000 students marched the picket line. Once junior high and elementary schools joined in the revolt, Texas Education Agency, or TEA, sent negotiators to end the walkout and get students back in school.
So, number one, they staged it December 9th, 2 weeks before we went out on the Christmas break. So actually, we only missed 2 weeks. Okay, but they were ready. Vista volunteers came in, teachers, and they taught us. I remember I had classes in the Juan Garcia Park. I had classes in what's called a community building. Now it's an elderly home. And then I had classes in another, in a social club building. So they were organized. They tried the best to keep us in the right frame of mind. And it worked. Those young people, and I know them very well, some of them are my friends, very close friends, they put it on the line. They put it on the line. And it was all because they, why is this happening to us?
The board wouldn't budge and refused to listen to the ideas proposed by TEA. Texas Senator Ralph Yarborough invited 3 student leaders to Washington, D.C. to discuss the discrimination in their school.
They also met with Senator Edward Kennedy and Senator George McGovern, who in turn alerted officials in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice and the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare of the serious situation in Texas. Overwhelmed by the student pressure, the school board finally held a hearing. The following demands were presented by the students.
All elections concerning the schools, such as class representatives, cheerleaders, twirlers, most handsome, beautiful, etc., will be elected by the student body.
The grades of students eligible for National Honor Society must be posted on the bulletin board well in advance of selection.
No other favorites should be authorized by school administrators or board members.
We want immediate steps taken to implement bilingual and bicultural education for Mexican Americans.
We want any member of the school system who displays prejudice or fails to recognize, understand, and appreciate as Mexican Americans our culture or our heritage removed from Crystal City's schools.
Teachers shall not call students any names.
Our classes should be smaller in size to ensure more effectiveness.
We want a free speech area plus the right to have speakers of our own.
Being civic-minded students, we want to know what is happening in our community.
The dress code should be abolished. We are entitled to wear what we want.
We request the buildings open to students at all times.
We want a Mexican American counselor fully qualified in college opportunities.
And so much more. On January 9, 1970, majority of student demands were reluctantly granted. That spring, Mexican American candidates swept the school board and the city council election.
With the student walkout still fresh on their minds, Mexican Americans under the leadership of Jose Angel Gutierrez organized their campaign strategy and founded La Raza Unida Party. They rallied enough support to capture 3 places on the school board.
Well, they've reversed the trend of student desertion, being pushed out of school, the regular things you hear about that Hispanics quit school and don't finish. Reversed that to being a college-ready and successful student environment. After we took over and made some changes, 91% of our graduating classes were going to college.
Within 2 years, the school's faculty, principals, and superintendents reflected the Mexican American majority.
What happened as a result of the walkout and then bilingual education and all these other things impacted schools everywhere throughout the United States, especially I know from here to California. And it is a big deal. Crystal City is known as the birthplace of the civil rights movement for Hispanics.
Crystal City Walkout remains a high point in the history of students fighting for their rights. It was the school's responsibility to give Mexican American students an equal education, and the students realized that. They fought and protested for what they believed in.